If you look around, there are so many ways to make a difference. At Capella University, our FlexPath format gives you a different way to earn your degree. Take courses at your speed. Move on whenever you're ready. Education should fit your life. Learn more at capella.edu.
Hello listeners, and welcome to this week's episode of The Cult Vault. I'm your speaker Casey, and I've been informed by the people working over on the Troubled podcast that there is an urgent call to action for any Indigenous residential school survivors or descendants of Indigenous school survivors to submit a testimony before the end of the week by following the link in the episode description. This work around the troubled teen industry is more important than ever, and now that doors are opening for survivors to be heard, we must take these opportunities where we can, so please consider sharing this information too. The testimony submissions close on Sunday the 22nd of May 2022. A big, huge welcome to Linda, who has become the show's newest patron. Thank you for being here and supporting this small platform in helping to get survivors' stories into the public domain and assisting in keeping this podcast going. I appreciate you, and I hope you enjoy the backlog of exclusive content. And on June the 18th, 2022, I will be doing a closed Zoom session with returning guests Spencer Schneider and Esther Friedman, and all patrons will be invited to this session. You can gain access to this event by subscribing to Patreon at patreon.com/thecultvault and pledging as little as £1 a month. It is also less than a month until CrimeCon UK in London on the 11th and 12th of June, and there is still time for you to get your tickets to the UK's biggest true crime event. Just visit crimecon.co.uk and use the code CULT to get 10% off of your tickets today. Now on to this week's episode, and it's a great one. I've been joined by journalist Syran Warner from The Body International to talk about an interesting group that he has been following for some time. There have been some huge updates on this since I spoke with Siren, and I hope to have him return to the show to bring us up to speed. But to get access to the updates before this, please consider visiting Siren's TikTok channel at Syran Warner, also included in the episode description. Now here is Siren. So hello, Siren, and thank you for agreeing to come and chat with me today. I am eager to get to know you and your work a bit better and hear some tales of your life as an investigative journalist, editor at The Body International, alternative media producer, and, as written on your Instagram page, poor person's excuse for a cult expert, which I love. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Yeah. Thanks you for having me so much. I'm a huge fan of what you do. I think it's great. So I'm a journalist in Minnesota, and I got my start at an alternative weekly paper where I wrote articles for them for about just about 13 years. I did a project called MPLS TV that was like video production for a few years, kind of in between there. And then I guess at a certain point, I started taking on more serious stories, and the cult came into the equation. After that, there was the pandemic, and then I got a bunch more information. I guess I had the time to dedicate to this story and to stories like it through kind of stuff. Some of it's by chance, but for the past year and a half, I've just been working on this project. I mean, it takes up all my free time. The cult world is now my world.
Do you feel like you have maybe found your niche or your calling in terms of a portion of journalism, like a space to cut out for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely do. I think that it was everything sort of changed when I started going down this hole and working with, especially, I work with other writers. I work with other talented people on the website. It's just something that's more appealing to me. Like what I was doing before was, I was doing a lot of like music journalism, culture journalism, before I did my first crime story. But I think like once you go into that world, everything else seems like sort of tame. So that's been, yeah, it's really rewarding, and I'm passionate about it, I guess.
That's so fantastic. And I suppose all of the experience that you've had before these projects is just laid the groundwork for you to kind of hit the ground running, in terms of really spending all your free time knowing where to look and where to dig and how to put all the pieces together.
Yeah, I like to be, I guess I aim to be sort of a Swiss Army knife when it comes to this stuff, to be able to wear different hats and do different stories and different perspectives, and edit different things. And I'm learning. There's a ton of stuff that I do that I'm a total novice at, but every time you do it, you get a little bit better. So
now that we know a little bit of how you found yourself in the field of journalism, what other topics and events have you covered or explored in the cultic space specifically?
Different topics, I guess. Well, in 2020, at the end of 2020, which was right before the paper I worked for, went down in the pandemic, ended up collapsing. I was working on a cover story about QAnon, and this was sort of really long in the works. And I wanted to say that like QAnon was a cult, so I was going to interview all these cult experts, and I had, I was in all these QAnon groups on Facebook, and I had this whole plan where I was going to, I was going to like infiltrate QAnon, find the people in Minnesota and interview them. And then it was pretty high concept article, but Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook shut down all these QAnon groups, so I couldn't really do the article that I wanted to do by the time the story got approved. So I, sort of backed up and was like, I'm going to include a bunch of cults in Minnesota. This is the very beginning of my journey into the cultiverse or whatever. And so I started just going through newspapers and finding all these crazy stories. And I had this whole, cover story. It was going to be a cover story. It's like 4,000 words of all these different kinds of stories that I was researching. And I decided that, when the paper went down, which was right before the article was supposed to be published, that I had all these things out there and I still wanted to explore them. So I started with these Minnesota cult stories. And if you look at the website, there's actually I think there's 4 stories or 5 stories that actually spun out of that. But then it's just been like talking to people too. I've found articles that I've written, and then there's all these, 10 other writers or people who have submitted content at some point or another, who have their own stories and bring their own stories to the table. So there's a lot of different avenues I've explored. And I know you mentioned there's that R. Kelly. I repurposed an R. Kelly interview that I had done in 2017 or something like that, or 2016, right before he was sort of tarred and feathered and people started calling him a cult leader. And so that was something I was able to work with. That was just this old file that I had that, it becomes a cult story once you tinker with it.
I saw that. I saw the R. Kelly video, and that kind of piqued my interest because I had already had opinions of him by the time you'd released that video. So when I looked at the timestamp for a while back, I was thinking, I've had thoughts about kind of a cult of personality in my head. Does R. Kelly kind of fit that model? And your video was just there, and I was like, oh wow, it's answering the question I had. But I do remember when the QAnon group shut down, especially the pro groups, on Reddit and Twitter. I remember all of those profiles and accounts kind of being taken down, and the QAnon support groups still exist on Reddit. So there's probably a space to interview people who are no longer followers of the movement, but nobody to really speak to actively involved in QAnon, I imagine, on those spaces currently. So it's a shame that all of that work didn't really go to the place you were hoping it would go to? Is there a way to perhaps repurpose that content in the way you did with your R. Kelly interview?
Yeah, a lot of it has been repurposed at this point. I interviewed one woman who was actually in QAnon, who was in this viral video where she destroyed a mask section at Target. They called her QAnon Karen on the internet. I put that interview up, and a couple other stories, like the very first article on the site, because originally the website wasn't really a magazine. It just like it was designed to inform people about this one specific cult. But I had a section that was, here are other stories you can learn from. And I did this one about this group in Minnesota called the Whipping Cult, and that was like the first article on the website. And so I have repurposed a few of those pieces. I don't know if I'll ever do the full like Minnesota story, just because I don't know if there's like a proper venue for it. And I do like I'm constantly wanting to explore new stories, but I may revisit some pieces of that again. There's a story about the SLA where this woman who was on the lam for like 30 years and wound up in Minnesota, Sarah Jane Olsen, I think was her name, or her assumed name. And that's something that I've wanted to repurpose that story for, a year, but it's just getting around to it. We'll see when that happens.
And the SLA, is that something to do with the Liberation Army and Patty Hearst, or is that something different?
It's the same story.
Wow. Okay. Because that's one of the ones that a lot of people interested in the field of cults or cult studies will go usually straight to the case of Patty Hearst.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's as good of an example of brainwashing as you could possibly imagine.
Absolutely. Somebody gets kidnapped and disappears for a while, and then when she pops up, she has a brand new identity, and it's absolutely wild, that case.
No, I think what's interesting about that case too, and this is something that I'm interested in a lot of stories, and in my own included, or the story of the body that is what I'm covering is, there's people who are cult members who are brainwashed commit crimes. Like you just saw, these people from NXIVM go to prison, and you have, Patty Hearst goes on trial, and Sarah Jane Olsen, I think she ended up doing like 7 years in prison or something like that. But it's a really interesting topic to me. Like when people are coerced and they're under somebody's control that much, like we don't really have a legal system to account for coercive control. So, I don't know, like a lot of people thought that, what was the name of the woman who went to prison in NXIVM? Allison Mack. Like a lot of people thought she should have gotten a lot more time in jail. But it's one of those things. I'm just like, I don't really have a place to judge it because, she was brainwashed.
And that's a very difficult dilemma when discussing movements that do use these tactics and methodologies. Recently there was a news article that I read about how Leslie Van Houten, from a former Charles Manson follower, she had put in a request to be freed, and the request was denied, and there was a lot of talk around whether she should still be incarcerated or whether there needs to be a really close look at the undue influence that she was subjected to, especially because, of course, Manson was using psychoactive drugs as well as manipulation and coercion. And I think there are some laws around coercion in America, but it's not really recognized in the way that perhaps it needs to be when groups like NXIVM come into the spotlight and you realize actually how dangerous these groups can be, and how they are made up of just everyday people, and they exist all around us, and the fingers of influence around manipulation and coercion exist everywhere. So perhaps there needs to be a very close look at the legal system, and lots of changes made around coercion. And I imagine that me asking you, what's in the pipeline is a difficult question when this rabbit hole of the body, which we're going to talk about today in depth, just keeps kind of getting deeper and deeper and deeper. So I don't know if you feel like there is an end point to your research or your journalism into this specific subject, or if you feel like it's just going to be constantly ongoing as things become kind of revealed to you.
I guess I don't really have like a end date. I mean, my goal really, I mean, more than anything, is to expose the body so that they can't recruit the way they like have in the past. I mean, that was the whole purpose of like putting up the website, is that, anybody interested in this stuff might be able to find it. Which is, there's a lot of difficulties involved in that. But yeah, that's the goal, is to expose this one specific group in a way. But I would say that, now that I've been doing this for as long as I have, it's hard to imagine just stopping. Like, even if, they were totally exposed by the, network news or something like that, I don't think I would stop doing the magazine part of it. Like, I think that's just going to go on as long as I can maintain it, as long as I can find writers, because it's just, I mean, it's such a big part of my life now, and these stories they're just important to me.
And you have an article on your website where you sat down and spoke with Pat Ryan from Cult News 101, which I thought was really interesting. So if anybody's not aware of what Cult News 101 is, it's like collection of all relevant media, articles, podcasts, magazines, documentaries, anything and everything to do with like the cultiverse. It's kind of compiled by these two people who then distribute it out on social media, on Instagram, Cult News 101, and via email. So I wake up every day to a new email that gives me sort of like the most recent headlines around cult activity around the world. And I just think it's really interesting, especially to sit down and see your interview with Pat around his work. I don't know if you had a chance to sit down and talk to him about what you had learned about the body, and if Patrick had anything to offer around his opinions or insights or thoughts around what you'd discovered about the group.
What was strange, I guess, is that he had heard about the group before, because they've been so underground. Like, other than my website and things that I've published, like, there's really nothing out there. I mean, there's records of them if you sort of know where to look, but it's a very sort of underground story because of they've kept it that way. But he had heard of them, which was interesting. We didn't go super in depth into it because I was more interested in his story.
Absolutely. And Patrick is going to be a guest on the show in a few months' time as well. So
nice.
We'll be able to talk more about Cult News 101 and his experiences with transcendental meditation and all that other stuff soon. But let's get on to the main subject of today's episode. We've already mentioned that the group we're going to be discussing at length is The Body, but it is The Body International as a full title. Is that right?
It's just the body. The thing, it's weird because they have adopted like multiple names over the years. Like, every time they sort of get in trouble, or not get in trouble, but every time they are risking some kind of exposure, they sort of flip the script and change their name.
Do the big old rebrand.
Yeah, and The Body International is just, I mean, I came up with that. I was trying to just have a website, and I knew this cult had spread internationally, so I just added, to make it easiest to find, I ended up having to add the international part. But generally, I mean, most of my records, most of the people I've talked to refer to it as The Body. In the leader's writings, he talks about the body in different ways, but they were known as sought out for a while, and then Veritas, which has made it difficult to reach the people that I intend to reach, because maybe they're not looking up the body, maybe they're looking up something else.
Yeah. So even if somebody was to go and research this new group that they've been approached by to see if there's anything, strange, dodgy, red flags on the internet that they should be aware of, it might be that the great rebrand has just happened recently and there's no trail online to give the prospective convert or new recruit a chance to read about that group. So The Body International is the name of your website, but the name of the group is The Body. So how did you first hear about this group? And I just love this story, so I'm going to get comfortable in my chair and let you lead the way.
So I guess this was back so it all started in 2016 before I made contact with The Body, but I had sold a story that was my first cover story, first crime story, and it was about I'd known this guy named Genghis Muskox who was murdered in Alaska, and I never heard the story until the summer of 2016. I thought, it really there was so much to it. It seemed like there was a lot of injustice and potential like corruption involved in the legal case against the guy who killed him. And I talked to my editor, I got that story approved, and I just started working on it. And it turned out to just be so much bigger than I expected. And I guess like when it comes to The Body, to make a long story short, I was interviewing a lot of reporters. Like, reporters were important for me to talk to because a lot of people had touched that story, and there were some people who just wouldn't talk to me. So I could sort of get perspectives and hear what other people had said through these reporters, especially being 1,000 miles away from where this all occurred. I needed that perspective because a lot of the other people I talked to had sort of built-in biases. And in 2017, I've been working on this story for almost a year, and I got in contact with a reporter named Katie, who was a radio reporter. Somebody got me on her list, or somebody put me onto her, I guess. And that was a really crazy time, but I approached her and wanted to do an interview about the story. And she knew everything about this case. But she had a very different perspective than I did. And she was close to it. And I imagine it was just a sort of holy shit moment for her when I called, because she had a personal connection to the case. Like, I knew Genghis, right. She knew Paul, the guy who killed Genghis. And after that, we started talking all the time and sort of trying to convince each other these, to see our perspectives or whatever. Right. And we ended up talking all the time. Our relationship, we would talk for like 2 hours a day, almost. Like we were on the phone all the time with this story because we were both looking at the same things, and we were both connected to it. And at some point, I talked to a lawyer in Alaska who I was running something by him that Katie had told me, and he was like, "Hey, Katie's in this cult, and there's penis washing and something like that, and she's in a sex cult." And I thought that was like the craziest thing I had ever heard. Like, he might as well have said like Katie works for the CIA or like Katie is a cosmonaut or something like that. Like, it just like didn't register in my brain that it could possibly be true. So, I mean, that was the first time I heard about the cult, but I guess I just didn't believe it the first time I heard it.
And you're having these lengthy conversations with Katie every day. She's becoming almost like a confidant. It's like two people that have opposing political views, and they try to kind of convince them to come over to the left wing or the right wing. So you're having these lengthy conversations all the time. You're both looking at the same situation. There's got to be some level of trust there within a relationship, even if you have opposing views, to spend that much time communicating with each other on a daily basis.
Yeah, I mean, there is some, I mean, there's bargaining here. Like the cult is a big part of our conversations. I just didn't know it at the time. I mean, the first time we talked, she was basically saying, you know, I have all this information that I think I want to share with you, but you know, I don't know if I can trust you yet. I've got to think about it. You know, but I have everything. I could answer every single question you got. She's basically saying, you know, I am the source. If you want to finish the story, like I am the source.
Wow. So
it's, you got to trust me.
Almost like those situations where people are like, I'm struggling financially, and somebody says, well, I know how I can make you loads of money. Or somebody says, I'm really struggling to hold down a job. Well, I can really change your, you know, potential for employment or your worth ethic. She's coming to you with the one thing that you really want at that moment in your life, which is answers to this case. Yeah. And she's kind of promising you that she can deliver on those things, but not just not yet, like really dangling the carrot.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's sort of exactly how I see it now, and it's even weirder than that too, because, you know, I ended up trusting her so much that, like, you know, she sort of convinced me. I'm agnostic. That like this all had to do with like God's plan, and you know, so many weird things had happened, like. You know, I had talked to Sarah Koenig from Serial, and, you know, I think that's part of the reason why Katie was unloading all this stuff on me, and why things got so weird is that she was sort of afraid of that potential of this being like a big story and her being exposed.
Right.
But I mean, yeah, I mean, I remember, like, I didn't understand until, you know, these conversations all happened in 2017. I never really revisited them until the end of 2020, when I was trying to see like what was going on. Like I had all this information about this cult that I had collected since then, and that I knew she was a part of. And I started listening to our tapes, and, you know, I heard myself say something about God, and I was just like, holy shit. Like I thought back and I remembered it. And I was like, this is a real thing. Like, this was like this really short sort of phase, but it was just something that she sort of convinced me on.
Wow, that must have been pretty scary to hear yourself say something that you don't feel like was yourself.
Yeah, I mean, the creepiest part is that what's creepier than that, I guess, is that, you know, I have all these. I was going through some of this tape. And, you know, I really thought I was in control of the situation. I really, like, you know, I just assumed things that turned out not to be true. And what's worse than hearing myself talk about God is in another, in maybe it was even the same tape. Like, I start just telling her, like, just personal secrets. She's asking me, like, questions about my personal life. And I'm just like, sort of, you know, I feel so comfortable with her. I'm just talking about these things that I was not talking to my friends about, that I was not talking to my family about, and sort of knowing what they did with information like that at the time, it was like terrifying. It was like, oh my God, like they could like blackmail me.
That sounds so similar to conversations I've had recently with Spencer Schneider and Esther Friedman about their experiences in the secret group in New York and Boston, sometimes referred to as the Odyssey Study Group, about how the recruiters would almost like date them in a way. They would meet for coffee for weeks and weeks, and the recruiter would say, tell me about yourself, I want to know all about you. And they rarely spoke about themselves, but Esther and Spencer, respectively, in their two different areas, spent so much time with these people, feeling so safe with them, spending hours talking about themselves. When they would say, what about you? They'd say, no, tell me more about you. Just gave them kind of that really safe environment to express themselves in a way they felt like they hadn't been able to in such a long time, felt like they were really being listened to. And then eventually they said, I'm part of a secret group. So it kind of feels quite similar to that in a way, that Katie's kind of slowly breaking down your walls. And I'm sure there was probably a point where you were like, I just need to speak to her. I just need her to get to trust me. If I can get her to trust me, she'll give me this information and I can just run this story. Of course, I don't know if that was ever her intention to give you all of the information that she promised she would hand over.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of the breakdown of where things, where I kind of woke up in this story as it was happening was that we had been talking for a few, we had long conversations for a couple days. And then she sent me a text message that was like, hey, were you recording our conversation yesterday? And I knew that I had, but I sort of answered vaguely because I was like, what is this about? Like, and I recorded everything. Like I mean, if it was about this case, I'm going to record it. If even the stories that I work on now, like, I try to keep records of just about everything. And so she had sort of tipped me off that she had, that this last tape that I had made, our last phone conversation, there was something weird about it. And I went back and she called me too and asked me, when do I record? What do I record? She was really interested in what I recorded. And I played it off as best as I could that, I don't know if maybe I was recording, maybe I wasn't. And in this tape, I found out that she had admitted to me in that tape that she had contacted all these politicians. Like she's just it's hard to imagine like a more politically connected Alaskan reporter than Katie Quinn at the time. I mean, she had all these like senators that she was close with. She just was like, she covered news and politics. And so she was connected to all these people, and she used her connections for this case where this guy committed this heinous murder and got 2.5 years in prison. And she had talked to the DA. She said she talked to the DA like every day, every other day for like 6 months preparing for an interview. It just seems insane to me. I mean, what's bizarre though is that the first time she said this when we were on the phone, it didn't really faze me. I didn't think, like, maybe it was because we talked so much that it was like I was not paying close attention to it. But this story was my world. It's so weird that I didn't like notice that or pick it up. But that was like, okay, so Katie has done something. I knew she had an inappropriate relationship with this guy as a journalist. But this was more sort of like beyond the pale, and what motivated her to do all this stuff is kind of a mystery. So that was kind of the breaking out point, where after that I was so much more careful with her because I knew I wanted to hear more about that story. Like that was what I was most interested in, and I guess I just like didn't trust her as much as I had in the past. So I was sort of like, at that point, I was like looking into Katie as well as looking into this story. Like she had become part of the story.
That must be so strange to be in that situation where sort of it's almost like a crime's being committed and you're looking outside of the home at all these potential suspects, and then you realize something or put some information together, and then you turn around and realize it's the person sitting next to you, and then you see them in a completely different light, and you have all of these questions, and you're kind of, you mentioned you go back over the tapes and you're hearing things and you're like, oh my goodness, it was there the whole time. I just didn't realize it until she said something that was a real red flag for you.
Yeah.
Wow, that must be so strange to have that sink in and realize that there was so much more you needed to go back and do to really see if all of the red flags were kind of right, if you weren't just jumping to conclusions.
Yeah, I mean, it was a trip. I mean, the other thing I guess that I haven't mentioned is that, you know, in this period where we're talking all the time, Katie had like quit her job in this really dramatic way, got fired. Basically, like, I was interested in stories that were getting covered up, and all of a sudden, you know, she was telling me that the newspaper, or the radio station that she worked for was like covering up her stories. And that, you know, it was this great injustice or whatever. I told her, you know, if you think you're gonna get fired and there's a meeting, go into it and record that meeting, which ended up being like, she did that, sent it to me. And, you know, it sounds heroic. She's like, you guys are covering up my stories. The boss disagrees. She ends up without a job. But after that, you know, I'm thinking like Katie's a hero for doing this or whatever, not knowing the full story. But she's asking me, like, how do I delete files? How do I delete emails? Like, I need to delete all this stuff. And she even convinced me to delete emails that she had sent me and to delete files that I had of her from the beginning. This is like the very first week that we were in contact. It might have been a weekend.
Wow, which must be a bigger deal for you than most people being a journalist, making sure you record everything, there's a trail of everything, there's backups and whatnot.
It's the opposite of like what I would do. Like it's you know, that I was so careful to make records of everything. It's just insane to me that that I would like go along with that and delete important files, or, you know, maybe I didn't know they were important at the time, but you know, that's just a wild sort of thing that I can't really explain, I guess.
It's definitely in keeping with the hallmarks of somebody going through the motions of thought reform or coercion, the severe personality change. And even in the documentary you sent me the other day, somebody that you are speaking to, he says, I did things that I never ever thought I would do. And that is so familiar for other interviews that I've done, for documentaries I've watched where people talk about being victims of coercion and manipulation. You know, those lines, I did things I never thought I would do. The severe personality change in not only your behavior, but also perhaps Katie's in how she kind of turns on her job and her employers and starts accusing them of things that maybe they haven't done, is almost in keeping with that as well. So it sounds almost like she could have been going through this personality change whilst you were going through these changes in your own behavior.
Yeah, I mean, it was a trip for me, and I'm sure it was a trip for Katie, but she, I guess she had the upper hand in a way. I didn't confront Katie until the end of 20 years later.
Right.
3 years later, I guess. But I didn't really know anything about the group. I just knew that Katie was up to no good.
Mm-hmm.
And that, like, our relationship was weird. Her relationship with this murderer was weird.
Right.
I knew, and people, the funny thing about this like media market in Alaska is that I would talk to reporters all the time who would just sort of like spill out what they thought of each other. Like people were super catty. So I heard things about Katie from other reporters, and just from, you know, what her reputation was like sort of at the time. like in the news media organization, but it wasn't until the next year, like a year after that, that I was kind of following something else, and I brought up Katie, that I heard, the second time I heard Katie was in the cult, which is at the beginning of that little documentary.
Yes, yep.
That's when I knew, like, oh, this is a real thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I loved how that opened as well, where the person's just like, oh yeah, she was in a strange cult, I would call it, and so that was a really compelling way to start. And it's interesting for me now to hear you put it into context in the way that you just have. So you're speaking to Katie in Alaska, as well as lots of other people, about this murder that takes place. Katie ends up kind of gaining your trust. You speak for lots of hours. There's a kind of strange change in her behavior. There's a strange change in you that you don't recognize until kind of hours and hours and hours and hours of conversation later. And so your attention kind of takes a sharp left, and you kind of divert away from the murder investigation or the trial, and kind of then start to look at this strange group operating in Alaska. How does that happen?
Well, what happened was I talked to the reporter who let me know about the cult, but of course she gave me sort of a rundown, which is like, there's another video of that elsewhere on the site, of just like, the original version of the story that she told me, which was, she didn't use names, but she told a different reporter named Rasha told me the basics of that story, and that Katie was involved. And the big thing was that Katie had done some inappropriate things as a journalist to sort of keep that story quiet. And it was remarkably similar to me as to, what she had done in this case of Paul Vermillion, the murderer.
Right.
Like, it was so strange that, like, we had both had this sort of situation with her, me and this other reporter, Rasha. And then but she wasn't going to give me the whole story, because she was thinking maybe she wanted to do something with it.
Right. Yeah, I think I would if I came across that material. I think that would definitely have kind of my prints all over it.
Yeah, and so I didn't talk to her again for like 6 months or something like that, this Rasha. But I researched the cult on I tried to find as much out about this group as possible, and there was just like, nothing online. Like, there was so little. There was like a Facebook post or something like that, but it was just like there was nothing really there, and I didn't have enough context for the stuff that even was there to know where to look. And at a certain point, like, I just thought, like, hey, this cult story is something. So I called Rasha back, 6 months, maybe 8 months later, and was like, is there anything else you can tell me about this group that Katie was a part of? And, she was like, she had like just revisited the story, and she was kind of excited to talk about it. And she said, hey, maybe we should do a podcast. Like, our stories intersect. You've got this murder case, there's this cult story, and like the fabric between them is this reporter, which that's a unique story. I've never heard a story about a reporter in a cult before. So that's when I started getting like the real information. Like, we set up a Dropbox, and she would send me files that she had recorded, because she had done interviews. A lot of this had happened in 2014 and 2015, where there were all these divorces in the body that made all these records, and all these spurned lovers, and marriages that ended, and kids that got split up and stuff like that. So she had sort of come into it like at the moment of this great schism, and had all these records from that we sort of went through, and that's where I got like a lot of the information. Like, some of the most important information comes from that time.
Wow. Okay. So at the point you decide to work with Rasha, do you know the name of the group, or had she provided at least that much information to you before?
No, I don't think so.
So you were really just going back into this, like, you know, is the group still there? Like, what, have you learned anything else? So did it kind of niggle away at you for those 6 to 8 months before you decided to recontact her?
Yeah, I mean, I thought about it all the time, and I think I might have even gone back and listened to my stuff with Katie, but I didn't know anything about cults. Like, I had no interest in cults before all this. I mean, I think I read Helter Skelter as a teenager, but it just wasn't like something that I was like super interested in, or that I knew about. So it was much later down the line when I started, talking to actual experts, and that I had some context for that. So nothing really seemed weird about our conversations other than what she was doing with this guy.
Mm-hmm.
But I found out the cult was named The Body because I got this tape from this guy Craig, who's heavily featured in that video, and he was pretty insistent at the beginning. It's called The Body, and the company is called Sought Out or whatever. Like, and he referred to it as The Body many times. So that's sort of how I found out the cult's name, because I don't think Rasha ever told me.
So you've managed to go and reconnect with Rasha. She's kind of given you access to some of the information that she has found out through this Dropbox account, and together the two of you start to piece things bit by bit. Do you kind of take some of the information that she puts into that Dropbox and take it a step further and start connecting dots and contacting other people? Do you visit Alaska? I'm just really interested in how this developed as a project for you.
Yeah, I visited Alaska in 2017, and I visited Alaska again just this past year, for I guess different purposes. I mean, the first time it was really about this murder story. The second time, it was kind of all about the cult. But I guess at that point, I'd been up there. I had a lot of my own information, but listening to these stories that Rasha had, these records, I guess I should say, like, the tapes were sort of flawed, or the story that she told had a lot of what I see today as, like, major flaws in it, where she didn't, she had all this stuff, she had talked to all these people, but there was all this blackmail that came from the cult that she bought into. I didn't know this, but she had like records from the cult that she never shared or mentioned. And the big thing was that, her story was all about these people who were like survivors and what they did wrong or whatever. But she was not focused at all on leadership.
Mm-hmm.
Like, she couldn't remember there's two guys in charge. There's Mark and Gary, who sort of run the operation. Mark, he's the guy in charge. And that was just like not really a topic of our conversation. So as we were working on that story, I was like, man, this is like lacking.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what kind of cult story this is.
Isn't it? It's Mark B, isn't it? You shortened his last name to B, right? So even I remember that from watching your documentary, that's the leader's name. Mm-hmm. So after collecting information on the group, I feel like that would be something you would remember or want to focus on. But maybe that's just kind of where me and you position ourselves in terms of looking at these groups as a whole, as opposed to kind of looking at almost the collateral of what leadership has caused in individuals, which are the survivors that she was looking at specifically.
Yeah, I think also that Rasha, maybe she wanted to sort of keep me at arm's length. Like, she didn't want me to, like, just insert this stuff in my magazine story, because I did end up writing a magazine story about the muskox and vermilion case. But in but at that time, I don't really know. I don't understand her side of that story at all. But I guess I know that she had all of this contact with these people that sort of went unmentioned. Like, I ended up getting all these records at the end of, a year or two later that, she had in the beginning and never told me about. And I got those from this guy in Australia, sort of randomly, but they're like such big components of the story. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I guess like I sort of give her the benefit of the doubt and say like, maybe this was just something that she wanted to keep to herself.
Yeah.
But I mean, the problem I have with that is like, there's allegations of child abuse, people are getting molested. Like, it's just not the kind of story that you sit on. Like, I mean, part of the reason why, I've put all this out there is that, you want that abuse to stop. Like, if there's any way to inform people so they're not abused, not molested, that's important. And even like, I've heard from survivors too, that who have talked, very few people have talked to me, but who are former members. But, the people who will talk have said, if I knew that somebody else had been through this, if somebody else went through what I went through and they didn't warn people about it, like, I would resent them forever.
Yeah. And it is difficult, as you said, you want to give the journalist the benefit of the doubt, but there is the other side of it, as you've just mentioned. I understand not wanting somebody to come in and kind of swoop in on all of the hard work that you've put together. So perhaps she was thinking that she could keep you as an ally by giving you kind of tidbits of information that she'd learned without giving you all of the things that she had managed to discover herself. But then, of course, it's no good if it kind of just sits on a laptop or sits in a notebook and you don't take it to authorities, or you don't run an expose yourself as a journalist, or you don't hand it over to somebody who can actually take that information and make some kind of change with it. So I do kind of understand not wanting to hand over all of your work, but I kind of see your perspective as well, especially because there are allegations of financial and spiritual abuse, as well as sexual abuse and sexual abuse of minors, but also the family separation that you mentioned as well. There's a lot going on in this group that you're right when you say, if you have this information, evidence of it, or anything, even just accusations of it from survivor testimonies, it's not ethical really to not do anything with that information. So I can see it from both sides. So you find out from Craig that it's called The Body. He kind of gives you loads of information about the group, and that, paired with what Rasha has provided you with, gives you a basis to kind of then hit the ground running and go on this journey of discovery about The Body. So can you give us a little bit of a history of the group, what you managed to find out in those early years?
Yeah, I mean, the history of the group, some of this stuff is like just getting filled in recently, like from people I've talked to after, I think that video maybe came out 10 days ago or something like that. And, I've gotten new information since then. But this all started, there was in the early 2000s, like in the year 2000, I guess, around there was this church group in Nikiski, Alaska. There was a Nazarene church that all these families went to, and some of these families like decided to break off and start their own church, like in their homes. And they, it was, I guess, a more extreme version of the Nazarene church, but it wasn't a cult really until in about 2003. One of these guys, Gary P, he had known this guy who was a preacher, Mark B, that he had grown up with. And Mark was like this sort of student in this church called the Church in Marshall, which is in Marshall, Texas. And there's like, that was a cult. I mean, the Church in Marshall was a cult. And I think, Mark was sort of groomed there. It's one of these, you hear these stories sometimes, there was a cult leader who grooms the next batch or whatever. And that's what happened in this story. So Mark goes up to Alaska to sort of be like this prophet and run his own church and takes over the group. And, so starting in about 2003, and then, it just got a little bit more extreme, a little more strange over time, became a lot more of a coercive organization, like all the problems that sort of I see with it. They're sort of there from the beginning because, this is Mark's intention. And he thinks that he is Christ. I guess that should be mentioned too. It's like he convinces these people like he is the same as the Son of God. Like he is, he is the Messiah in a way. And it's like their secret that he knows all this stuff. And then, in 2014, there's this great schism in the church where basically Mark wanted to prune down the people who were a problem. Like some people weren't totally on board, including his wife, including Gary's wife, and there was a woman that he was interested in. So he wanted to get rid of her husband, and he wanted to get rid of Craig because he wanted to have access to his wife. So that's when like all these records are created. This is when like people in town are talking about it. Like people had sort of found out about the group. And then, they moved to Hawaii, and then they end up in Washington State, and then they splinter, then there's a sect now in Australia. So that's like I guess just like if you're talking about like the timeline, that's sort of the sequence of events.
A lot of the footage in your documentary as well. Is Craig the Australian guy that kind of takes you on a tour of the property?
No, that's Peter.
Right. Okay.
Who is Katie's dad.
Right. Wow. Okay. Now that is interesting.
Yes. So Peter is Katie's. I mean, a lot of these people are related, and Katie and Peter are the only like Australians. But Katie found the church when she was in school. She visited Alaska, found it. I don't know if she went there specifically for it, but she brought her mother and father to Alaska. Like they all got like visas, and they were in the church for a little while. But Katie's mom wasn't into it. She ended up leaving that.
Wow. So it really is like I wrote in my interview questions, like trying to connect everything with the red string. The connections are wild. So where did you get that video footage from of Katie's dad taking you around the property?
I found that on YouTube. Like I knew that there was a video of him explaining the property or whatever. Like I had seen this like 15-second clip that's in the video of him saying like, hey, we're on the land, blah, blah. But there was really nothing to it. And then I was listening to an interview I had done where this video came up, and it was clear to me that like there was some kind of video that I just hadn't seen. And so I went back and I found that YouTube account and clicked on, videos, and that popped up, that sort of tour around the compound with the body had this compound in Nikiski where they were all like living on the land, and that's where these washings happened. And
right. Wow. Okay. So just to kind of go back over that timeline briefly before we get into kind of those details that you just mentioned, the two leaders, or at least Mark himself, part of a Nazarene church, there's some kind of dispute or falling out, or kind of Mark wants to take things in a different direction. So he splinters off and creates his own group with a following. They purchase a piece of land in Nikiski, Alaska, and it's quite a significant size as well, as we can see in your documentary, which I'll provide all the information for at the end of the episode, and kind of add a link into the episode description as well. But people kind of start to build mobile homes, there's tents, there's teepees, people are moving onto this land to follow Mark and be part of this commune. And then Katie's dad goes on to say that, we need this land because Mark has told us that people will be drawn to this place soon. So there'll be thousands of people, and this is where we're going to live. And
I guess that I think that video was made, like, it was made in 2015, which is at a time when people in the community were talking about the group. Like they weren't as anonymous as they had been. And I think that video, it's such a bizarre video, but I think the point of it is to be like, hey, this is totally normal. Like, what's going on here? Like all the weird stuff you're hearing about, like, that's not the case. Like, this is just our little commune.
That would make a lot of sense as well. And one of the parts that really stood out to me about that video footage is where the guy's like, yeah, such and such has a teepee, said he's always wanted a teepee, but he's got 4 kids and 1 on the way, so we might have to put in another teepee. And I was like, there is nothing on this land other than tents and teepees, and there's like a whole family living inside this small tent. And that really kind of stood out to me. There doesn't seem to be kind of any facilities for like cooking and cleaning, not that we're shown anyway, toileting and things like that. Perhaps they had like portaloos and things that they were using at that time, but there doesn't seem to be any actual irrigation in place, power lines. Of course, I'm talking about comfortable living, I suppose, from a privileged position here in my house. But that would make sense that video is released for the reasons that you stated before, to kind of just say, hey, we're just cool, we're living off the land, we live in tents and teepees, there's nothing strange going on here. And at one point he does say, this is where we get together, here's the big tent where we get together, which is where some of these more strange rituals or practices may be taking place. So 2014 and 15, there's a lot of divorces that you and Rasha have managed to find and kind of track. Divorces you think are conducted or orchestrated by Mark so that he can participate in polyamory with the wives of his followers?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was 2, just like, his wife was a problem if he's going to be sleeping with other women. Craig is a problem because he's not buying totally into it. He's the only person who's not like texting with Mark to do everything. He is one of these cult members who's sort of like in and out of, I think he was uncomfortable with Mark. He says in the video he never would have left on his own without getting kicked out, but he wasn't the great pupil that Mark wanted him to be.
Okay.
Like all these people that went through these divorces, they were just like, they were either a problem for Mark or they were like going to be a problem for Mark in the future.
Okay, so there's a guy who has this property. The name of the group is The Body, but the company that the property is bought under is named Sort Out. So they're 2 different names, but essentially the same group. And so Mark has convinced followers to give as much as they can, sell up wherever they are, give inheritances, give as much financially, vehicles, property that they can over to Mark in order to purchase this property. And then from that, there's interviews that you have included in your documentary with survivors who go on to detail the strange practices that take place on this particular piece of land in Nikiski, Alaska. So I wondered if you could just talk us through some of those strange things that started to come out from your interviews with survivors of this group.
I guess I heard about the washing in the beginning, just from Rasha, and then I got a tape of somebody. A lot of the tapes that I got from her described this sort of practice, which is like the washing of feet, like from like the John the Baptist story in the Bible, I believe. Like, but it's really like, you strip down, everybody's naked, the leaders are naked, there's the people are like groping each other and dancing, and the subject gets washed with water in a cloth or something while they're naked, and it's very thorough, and they wash genitals, and they in that video you can hear like they're requesting, Mark is requesting that like he be touched too. Like, it's this very sexual perversion thing, but a lot of people didn't see it that way at the time, like people who were involved. I know about one person who wasn't washed.
Did you know 77% of women who wear bladder weakness products experience intimate skin irritation?
As if having incontinence wasn't stressful enough.
But Tena Intimate Pads have been gynecologist tested and do not cause skin irritation.
Gentle on my intimate skin. I need to try Tena Intimate Pads.
Visit TenaSample.com for your free sample. Kind to skin, protects like Tena.
Sometimes you need to take control to make a difference. That's why with FlexPath from Capella University, you're in control. Set your own deadlines and leverage your experience to move at a pace that works for you. Discover a different way forward at capella.edu.
But like sort of was angry that they weren't, that nobody would wash them.
Right.
Because it was such a huge part of the group. Like, it was like, the next step was this practice. So that's one of the things that's out there. And I guess, there's a lot of little practices like that sort of go against what like a traditional Christian group would be. I mean, in particular, like they don't celebrate, there's like this Jewish strain of like, the body is this kind of combination that combines like old Judaism with like old ass Christianity. Like,
right.
It's really confusing to me, but I have had people explain it.
Like messianic influences almost. Like
I don't know if
observing the Sabbath on Saturdays and not celebrating birthdays and Christmas.
Kinda. No birthdays, no Christmas,
right.
No Easter, but they celebrate like Pentecost. Like Pentecost is
right. So yeah, a very kind of a mixture of a few different religions coming in there.
Yeah, and there's, I mean, if you read like the text, I mean, I have so much. I've gotten recently so much of Mark's writing, and him talking about this stuff in his own words, and it's very, there's all kinds of Hebrew in there, like Hebrew is a very big part of the body, because that's what Jesus spoke. Like, this is all supposed to be like, we're going back to Jesus,
right?
And the Jewish stuff is in there because Jesus is Jewish, and I mean, I'm not going to claim to understand it completely because I'm not a religious studies major or whatever, but I have a better grasp on it. But that's right. Certainly an element too.
So not necessarily in keeping with Nazarene beliefs and practices, but perhaps taking a few influences from various different major branches of Christianity and adopted what works for himself, as in Mark, and just kind of running with a number of different parts of other major Christian sects. And as somebody who's had experience in a religious setting, who may be familiar with religious texts, it may be here where the spiritual abuse comes in. And that's how people are able to be encouraged or convinced or coerced into taking part in something like washing of the bodies, washing other people's bodies, or allowing your own body to be washed in an environment that is extremely intimate, where you are completely naked. Of course, that type of situation may already pave the way for some type of physical and sexual abuse. But if Mark is well versed in various different religious texts or interpretations of the same religious text as in the Bible, then he may be able to explain away or justify his reasonings for encouraging things like washing the body. And so there could be a lot of spiritual abuse there. But also, you mentioned, somebody was upset that they didn't get washed, and that could be where the conformity aspect of the group think comes in, where a lot of these groups have pyramid or tier or hierarchy structures, and so it's giving participants something to strive for, something to reach for, like a goal, like with the Jehovah's Witnesses. You strive for your baptism because it's such a huge major event where you're so overly love bombed and celebrated, and it's a step closer to Jehovah and your relationship spiritually with Jehovah in that sense. So it's almost the same in, once you're accepted into this group, you'll then be accepted into this practice or this ritual, which is washing of the bodies. And until you reach that level, you're almost lesser than or seen as less than, because you're not having your body washed or washing other bodies. So it almost encourages people to want to take part in that practice, even if it's not appropriate, because they are missing out. So it's kind of the FOMO thing as well, the fear of missing out that comes into play there. Lots of mental gymnastics taking place here just with that one particular practice. And as Katie's dad explains in the video, there are children actively living on the commune at this point. And if it's a group practice where everybody is in the same environment with no clothes on, taking part in this practice, it makes you worry that there may be children involved or children witnessing this. And if they aren't, then perhaps they are being left to their own devices whilst adults take part or participate in these practices, which is another cause for concern as well. So loads of different things to consider in terms of just this one strange practice that takes place in the body.
One thing I would say, to back up just a little bit, is that the washings are, Mark justifies this stuff biblically. People who left the organization were surprised when they found out that this wasn't in the Bible, because that's what Mark said. And the family separation, getting rid of people, all justified by Bible verses and such. So it's all you have to imagine these are very these people want to be closer to God, and that's kind of what you're saying, with people wanting to participate in this kind of stuff. They have been manipulated through spirituality. I mean, it's that sort of spiritual abuse.
Absolutely, yeah.
They didn't come to this idea that they wanted to be washed on their own.
No,
that's something that just comes from it comes from Mark and what he wants.
Yeah, and that's why it's kind of difficult if Mark is drawing inspiration and influences from various different major Christian sects as well, because he'll have lots of different interpretations to draw on when using spiritual and biblical text and rhetoric to back up his claims that he is a Messiah, that he is godly in himself, and that the reason he is encouraging people to participate in these strange practices is because that's what God wants, and that's what's written in the Bible, as stated here in this verse and in this text. And when the spiritual abuse comes in, it's very difficult to first to recognize, second to comprehend, but mostly to tackle, because it's not something that can physically be seen. If somebody has bruises on their body, you can see that they've been physically assaulted. But of course, spiritual abuse isn't like that. So it's a very difficult one to tackle. And there's been so much around trying to highlight that malicious practice that takes place in a lot of religious settings and high demand religious groups. And for anybody that's looking to learn more about spiritual trauma, spiritual abuse, or religious trauma syndrome. Of anybody that's a frequent listener will know that I always just direct people to Jeffrey Wallace's work as a physically and mentally out Jehovah's Witness that speaks out against the Jehovah's Witness faith around their shunning practice, and of course lengthy discussions around the subject of religious trauma syndrome. So if anybody wants to learn more, then you can go and visit Jeffrey's website today. And I suppose the next part of our journey to discuss is that people in the area are looking at this group, they're talking about this group, and at some point there is a lot of attention on the body. Is that why they uproot and move away, or is it because of there was some mention of a pipeline in your documentary? Was that the cause for their move?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination of both. Like that land that they had ended up being worth like a ton of money. I think they paid $200,000 for it. It ended up being worth millions, like shortly thereafter. So they got all this money, and then at the same time, like in these divorce hearings, like what really changed everything is that there were all these recordings of Mark. Like, you know, Mark is God, and you were, as a member, you're supposed to record what he says because, you know, these are the words of God. Like this is the new chapter of the Bible or something. You know, you got to keep it for posterity. So a lot of his recordings, some of the recordings are in the video. I mean, a lot more of the recordings are just on my website of him, you know, saying, you know, very dangerous things, saying very sexual things. Like that stuff sort of came out in court. And then, you know, there's all these reporters in there. There's people that know about it. And it just became sort of gossip. And I think Mark had the idea that, like, you know, if this continues, if this gets worse, and, you know, there's these people that are liabilities in the group, like the situation is going to get bad. Like, you know, I think there was just a decision at some point, like, we got to get out of here because, you know, we've got the money, and, you know, no reason staying around where like people know what we're doing and who we are.
Right. So do you know if they changed their name before they move over to Hawaii, or do they change their name once they relocated?
They I think Veritas came up in like 2015 or 2016. It was like before they moved. But they were called Veritas, and this, you know, and it was this time it was registered in Peter's name and this other guy in the group, Chris. So, but I mean, you know, it's still there to be like this religious corporation that, you know, doesn't pay taxes or something. I don't know what kind of money was going on with that group, or how money changed hands or whatever, but they had it for, you know, a financial purpose. That's clear enough. But yeah, I think by the time they wound up in Hawaii, they were Veritas. And
I think that Veritas means truth in Latin. Perhaps Veritas was the goddess of truth, or it's truth in Latin. I don't know if it one or the other. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you Google like something, if you Google Veritas Church, there's a ton of results because there's a ton of churches called Veritas. Like it's like, you know, it's sort of like this like camouflage name. Like all their names are really, you know, Mark is just not very creative. Like Sought Out, The Body, Veritas are like name generator for like, let's say, plugged in a name for the church.
Do you know what year they landed in Hawaii?
I believe it was 2017, but I'm not 100% certain on that. I know that, so when I was talking to Katie after she left the radio station, she all of a sudden like moved to Hawaii for a little while. And a lot of our conversations were with her in Hawaii, which, I mean, the time difference there was insane. But but she went and visited the body. That's why she was there. That's who she was with. So I know that for sure, by June of 2017, they were in Hawaii. Not everybody, but like most everybody.
It's strange because when I read that they almost fled to Hawaii to escape the scandal or the whistleblowing or the gossip or whichever way it kind of played out in Nikiski at the time, it reminded me of how the group Love Has Won did the same thing as well. But when they arrived in Hawaii, because there was so much information about them on the internet, the Hawaiian citizens kind of pushed them back out of the country. They were just like, we don't want. They stood like with placards protesting the arrival of the group, saying we don't want you here, you can't stay here, and so they had to turn around and leave again.
And that's, it's funny that you mentioned that, because that is, I don't know very much about Hawaii. Like I know that they were basically making all the records they created are in this guy named Ted's name. Like all I can, and without like seeing his records, I just know their PO box and like cell phone information and stuff like that. But what I've heard from Craig, this former member, and this former member's son, is that they were sort of pushed out. Like there was, like when they were in Hawaii, they sort of started trying to become part of the spiritual community, and there's all these priests that sort of had an idea what they were up to. And that's why they left Hawaii and moved to Washington.
That is so similar, I think, to what had happened with Love Has Won. I think the leader of the group, Amy Carlson, she was trying to, she often claimed that she was a reincarnation of many famous people that have existed in the world. And she started to claim that she was a reincarnation of the goddess Pele. And Hawaiian citizens, they take their they take their history and their spiritual beliefs very seriously. It's very sacred to a lot of people that practice their faith over in Hawaii. There's a big LDS presence as well, which I'll talk about in a second. But after Amy Carlson said, we're going back to my homeland, my motherland, this is where I belong, this is where I was born, and I'm going to return to the land, the natives were so upset by her kind of coming out with this big revelation that was one of the reasons why they lined up on the beaches saying that we don't want you here, which is interesting that this group, the body, went to Hawaii, tried to integrate themselves into the spiritual community, and they were just kind of like, absolutely not. Especially if Mark is as egocentric as we think he is, he would be trying to impose his beliefs and his rhetoric on the citizens of Hawaii, who already are very strong in their own belief systems and probably not ready to hear the word of a man that just kind of arrives in their country and expects them to listen to every word that he has to say, much like his own followers do at that point.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this is where the body has gotten in trouble, is that like they try to recruit people from other churches, and I think maybe that was what was happening there. I mean, that's how they got exposed in Australia, or the small sect that's over there is just like from going to different churches and trying to tell people about their own beliefs, and I think maybe that's what got them in trouble in Hawaii. I mean, I can't confirm it. Like this is just something that like I've heard that people believe, and I've heard it a few times. I heard it again, another story about it recently, but I haven't talked to anybody who left the body during that period, and survivors are really the only way to know what was going on. So I mean, I'm hoping to get more of that information, learn more about what was going on in Hawaii, but
kind of just to fill in those blanks.
Yeah.
And another comparison I drew as well was with a couple whose court case is ongoing at the moment, called Laurie and Chad Daybell, Laurie Vallow and Chad Daybell, who are now married and did get married in Hawaii after they fled America after the murders of Laurie's children, Tylee and JJ.
Oh yeah, I know
and
that story.
They started to say that, you know, they'd met in a past life, and all of this strange belief system and rhetoric that the couple had in place that they were kind of imposing on their closest followers and believers, which were kind of close friends and family members, and lots of different systems around people being light or dark. And then eventually, after the kids went missing for a long period of time, law enforcement were able to actually find the bodies on Chad Daybell's property. But it was another strange parallel for me, after kind of doing a few hours of research on that case, to see this couple go over to Hawaii to become a part of the LDS community over there and to get married over there, all whilst this kind of event with her children had just happened. And she's just kind of playing it off like, oh, they're with a friend, or oh, they're with their grandparents. And they obviously, of course, never were. So that court case is still ongoing, and we hope to kind of see that play out in a way that gives Tylee and JJ some type of justice. I mean, a guilty verdict is still never going to be enough, but hopefully the actual hearing will bring forward into the public realm what was actually happening around the religious rhetoric, and how people were able to buy into this, and how Laurie and Chad came up with these narratives that they'd created, because there were a lot of other people in the situation that were affected. You know, Tammy Daybell died, Laurie's brother died in strange circumstances. There's so many children involved in this story, so it'll be interesting to see how that comes together as well. But your next kind of stage of research takes you over to Australia. So the group are in Hawaii. They don't make too many friends, so they decide to relocate again over to Australia, which is where a sect of this group still exists. So do you think Australia was a choice because of Katie and her father and the influence that her family had in the body? Or do you think Australia was just perhaps a place that was far enough away from America and the gossip and the slander, but also enough where there's a spiritual movement for them to infiltrate?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've heard a few stories, and I think that there's truth in pretty much all of them. It's been explained a few different ways. I know what Katie told me. I guess I trust this guy who discovered them in Australia that I got in contact with most. I think that, there's this appeal to get, Peter used to be a Baptist minister in Australia, in this place Tumut. So he has like some sort of connections from when he was a priest. So going there, kind of makes sense. Like, he's familiar, like people will know him and he'll be able to recruit people. But what I think is more interesting is that, like, it's Peter and Melissa. Like, Peter is this old man who's married to Melissa, who abandoned 6 children, including a 2-year-old, to go on this pilgrimage. She left all her kids behind to marry this old man that she has like no connection with, that she, from what I heard, isn't a fan of, or wasn't a fan of before, to join in Australia. But what's interesting is that, like, Peter and Melissa and Katie, they sort of like, they might be the most problematic members of the group. I mean, Katie, I don't think is in it anymore. I think she's gone, but Peter and Melissa definitely are still in. Peter sticks out like a sore thumb, and he's the only guy who's like, he made a video. Who knows? I doubt Mark told him to make that. Like, he's sort of like a free agent sometimes. Like, Like, and he's got this Australian accent, so you stick him in Hawaii or wherever in America, like people are going to know he's not from there. And he's just, I think Melissa is this liability too, because like if it comes out that she abandoned all these kids and she owes all this child support payments and all the, I mean, her story and her relationship with her stepfather. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why these people maybe aren't the best to have around if you're trying to like build a church, like, and I think that's part of the reason. I mean, I've heard that theory, and I guess that's maybe something that I sort of buy into too, is like placing these people on the other side of the world, like, good luck, making your own body. And I know they've been supported financially. Like, I know they were given like a large amount of money. That's what it looks like for their house. And they don't really, neither one of them like have really worked in their lives. So I don't know how bills are getting paid or whatever, but it's possible that having them over there is just like the best thing for Mark right now.
Right.
And that's why they're there.
And as far as that's where they're still located to this day.
Yeah, I just got an update, and they're sort of in hiding, and I guess I heard that they haven't really been seen, but they're known to be there. And Peter shaved his beard is the last thing I heard from the last person that saw him.
And we've heard the names, the Body, Sort Out, Veritas. Do you know what other names they've used up until this point and the name that they are currently using right now?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I think there's like this weird shell company that the members, there's a few members' names on, which is called Sage Mountain Studios. And this is just sort of like after Sought Out, after that like corporation dissolved or whatever, or not corporation, but religious nonprofit, whatever it was classified as. After that dissolved, like everything started getting put in other people's names, because I mean, Mark is he's paranoid, and he doesn't want to get sued, and he's worried about the FBI. Like he doesn't want any of this stuff in his name anymore. So I believe that this new company, which is an LLC in Tonasket, Washington, called Sage Mountain, is like the new Sought Out or Veritas or whatever.
Sage Mountain Studios as well sounds like it could be the start of some type of propaganda.
Yeah, and I mean they just bought all this land there too. It's a bigger piece of property than they had in Alaska. So, I mean, I don't know what the exact plan is. I mean, it's hard to say.
Are you going to keep your ear to the ground and your eyes wide open?
Oh yeah.
Right. So you went over to Alaska in 2017, more for the original murder case that you were working on. Is this when you went to go, did you visit the property at this point?
No. Well, what's crazy, this insane thing that didn't happen is that Katie had set me up with all these people. Like, I called her right away when I found out I was going to Alaska, and she's like, oh, I know this politician. So me and this politician were going to go fishing, which didn't end up happening, but I talked to him about it, which is good because there's a record of it. But I was also supposed to stay with Katie's dad, like I assume on this property.
Whoa.
Like she was like, because I was asking her, like, I'm staying in Airbnbs and this is a really expensive trip. Like, do you know anybody I can stay with? And she was like, oh yeah, you can probably stay with my dad. And I talked to Peter on the phone a couple times when I was there, but I was with this driver that was like taking me around to these places. And like, there was a problem with the car. So we ended up like, we couldn't get the car fixed where we were, but we could get it fixed like 2 hours away. And that's the only reason I didn't end up like staying with the body.
Wow.
And there was also, I mean, she had like, she wanted me to shoot guns with somebody who might have been marked. Like, I don't know exactly what she had like in store for my itinerary, but like I was very close to like, you know, the cult when I was there the first time.
That's so interesting, because if things would have played out differently, we might not be having this conversation right now.
Yeah.
You might be
how I
living
feel
over in
about it.
Australia.
Yeah, who knows?
That's so strange to think about. And when you went back in 2021, was it?
Yeah, just last June for the solstice.
Did you manage to visit the property at that point, even though it was vacant at that time?
Yeah, there wasn't really much to see there. Like there's a lot of there in that video that I put out, there's a lot of overhead shots of this land, like this strip of land where you're just looking at trees, like going over property.
I have in my notes here, I've got drone ? And I was going to ask you how you managed to get all of those overhead shots.
Yeah, and that's sort of like, that's the area. It sort of repeats. There's other properties there that have nothing to do with the body, but it is that's where it is.
Right, and is it was it a drone that you used to capture that footage?
Yeah, I wasn't I hired a like drone pilot. I didn't really. Yeah.
I just thought it was really cool. I was thinking usually they have to use big helicopters, but I know that there are some savvy people out there today that can work a way around that. And the footage was really clear and really high up. So that was quite impressive for a drone, I think.
Yeah, and it's not even, that video isn't even in HD. Like I wish it sort of does a disservice to the quality of the video. But yeah, I knew this guy who I basically told him, you know, if I'll pay for your plane ticket and I'll pay for the car.
Wow.
Like if you come to Alaska and just like fly drones and you get a free, crazy, insane trip to Alaska where we're looking at this cult.
What was his reaction to all of the information as you were going through it?
He was into it, but I think it got a little uncomfortable because I had two people, like the producer of the video also came with me, Syran, where once we had to like interview people and talk to people about the cult, and you know, I interviewed a former member, I interviewed somebody like very close to Mark when I was there, and I think some of that stuff, like once it got real, I think the video guy was like a little uncomfortable, right, when it became like, oh, this is a real thing, and like we're going to be talking to people about abuse and stuff. Like,
yeah, I always see people like on there's a couple of subreddits I follow of people that kind of bash true crime enthusiasts who go around the world posing kind of with big smiles and thumbs up outside the properties where, you know, people were actually murdered. And I imagine that those people would react very differently if the serial killer that was involved in the crimes happened to just turn up on the street outside the house where they're posing with these massive smiles. So it would make it real for those people at that point that these crimes actually happened, you know, or if they were to actually sit down and speak with the victims' families who were impacted by these awful crimes and these awful people, they might then think, oh, this is not actually something to smile about. And so it's kind of the same thing with your friend when he's like, yeah, cool, this is like an abandoned property. And then somebody comes forward and says, so these horrible things happened here on this property. And then he's kind of a bit like, oh, okay, well, that kind of makes it real, makes it very different.
Yeah, and it's this weird juxtaposition too. Like, it's a really ugly story. Like, I mean, every cult story sort of is. But I mean, the location, it's like so gorgeous. Like all these places where the body winds up turn out to be like these beautiful, beautiful locations. But the Kenai Peninsula of Alaska, where Nikiski is like, you know, it's just breathtakingly beautiful. You know, you can sort of see in that video, like there's pieces where it's like, you know, that's what this area looks
yeah.
like. Like you go on a drive.
Peter even says in the footage, you know, look how beautiful this place is. We're right by the water. Here's the cliffs. This is another reason why Mark says people are going to be drawn to us because of where we're located. So you can tell from Peter's talking in his video that you pulled from YouTube, he's relaying the messages that Mark's giving the group in these get-togethers, where he's saying, you know, look where we are, people are going to follow us, they're going to be drawn to us and gravitate towards us because of where we are. We're in this beautiful place, you know, maybe putting words like utopia and Eden next to the rhetoric that he's putting out at that time. But you can definitely see that in the documentary that you put out recently. Which is kind of my next question or next point. So can you tell us where we can find the documentary and the full title of it if anybody is interested in going to have a watch of it themselves? I will also include it in the episode description.
Okay, yeah, the video is called The Land of the Body, I guess, an Alaskan cult story. So it shows up in searches. But I think if you look up, even if you just look up like cult documentary, like it's in the on the first page or something like that. You might have to scroll, but the Land of the Body is how most people find it on YouTube. And I guess like when I built that video, it was I had that video of I had that YouTube of Peter that I just was like fascinated with. You know, I watched that video so many times. And then I had this audio of Craig, this former member, talking about the land. And I had all this drone footage and I sort of like started piecing that together. And then I realized like, oh, from this land, you can almost tell the whole story.
Absolutely.
Or you can tell like, you know, it's not the whole story, but you can tell a large part of it through like this land and these companies or whatever. And I just sort of whipped through it, and it's, you know, took a week, I guess, to put together and then put it online.
Are there going to be sequels or other parts to it now that you've got more information coming forward?
Yeah, there's definitely going to be more video. I've gotten in contact with a new editor too, because my problem is like I know some stuff about video, but I don't know anything about editing, and I'm terrible at it. And you can tell that from like watching any of the videos on the website. So I want to work with somebody else who can edit it and do the things that I can't, that I'm just clueless about. But I guess, you know, I've got another video that I've just started like capturing, which is about the church and Marshall and the leader of that, which I think is going to be like really, it's out there. It's sort of like in this guy's own words, like we're going to observe what it is. And it's some of it is spectacular. It's really, it's hard to explain. I don't want to like totally give it away.
Right.
I guess what I would say, I think, that will be out by the time this episode comes out, I would imagine.
Okay, great.
And then I want to do something like that video, The Land of the Body. I guess I'm trying to decide now. I want to narrate the thing because it's really confusing if you don't know anything about the story. You know, it's just like clips of interviews. There's no narration. There's a little bit of text, and it's just the story through people's own words.
Yeah.
But I do want to like make a version where maybe it's split up into like a few, you know, shorter videos.
I think that would be great.
It's narrated. Yeah. Where it's like the story is being told, and you get like a more complete picture. So
absolutely. I think
that'll probably take a while, but it'll come eventually.
Yeah, and like you said, you're totally committed to this project. You can't see yourself dropping it or slowing down anytime soon. More information is becoming available to you on a daily basis. You've had more since you made that documentary. So especially if you hire an editor, because you've got the information, you've got the research, you've got the materials, and you've got the vision. So once you have an editor who can put all of that stuff together, I mean, it's a home run, hopefully, in raising awareness about this group. I think if somebody was to listen to this episode and then they were approached in Australia by a group who kind of, had lengthy discussions, much in the same way that Spencer and Esther experienced with the Odyssey study group, and then eventually got invited to a service where people were washing each other's naked bodies, they might be able to go, oh my goodness, I heard about this in an interview. So even though the name of the group changes, there's still earmarks of this particular group that stick out. And even if there are one or two other groups in the world, or maybe even a few groups in the world that use the same practice, it is perhaps this conversation is enough for people to kind of just take a step back and have a conversation with themselves about what kind of religious group might use those practices or include them in their get-togethers. So one thing I thought was interesting about your documentary was the YouTube comments. There was a few people that came forward with some interesting bits that you were reacting to, like, oh my goodness, it's so strange for me to read this comment, and those things. Mm-hmm. There were a few that came forward and just said this is a lie, or there's no evidence of anything. Yeah. So I felt like that might actually be brigading from members of the group kind of coming onto the YouTube channel to defend the group, or apologists for the group itself, because otherwise, unless you're interested in cults and cultic studies, unless you're a follower of the Body International, why would you be watching that video? It just seems kind of like a really strange thing to be watching unless you knew about it or you were studying cults, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it is. It's sort of bizarre that it's spread around Alaska. It's funny that you mentioned that too, because like an hour before this interview, there's a new comment on there, a new long comment from somebody who knows the story about Katie or knows about like KSRM, somebody, the gist of it is that, me and my friends or whatever contacted the radio station and to report, there's this cult in Nikiski, and we talked to somebody who was like drinking the Kool-Aid, and and I'm just like, yeah, of course, that's Katie, that's who was talked to or whatever. And it's just like this bizarre piece of the puzzle that I've never heard before. And I've heard different things like on, in Facebook groups where this stuff was spread in Alaska, where a lot of the views come from. People have said things, people have reached out to me. But yeah, those video comments, like some of them are really interesting.
And KSRM, is that the name of the station that Katie was working at when you were in touch with her? Right, okay. And you said that you confronted her in 2020. So what was that communication like?
Well, it's I guess it's not in the video, but it's what happened was that me and Katie ended up talking. You can see in the video, there's like the only like person in the video that you see is Katie. Like she's on video sort of at the end of at the end of it.
Right, yep.
And she says, I was in this cult. I was married, but it was like the marriage was a fraud. So that was like our first conversation, which was this long conversation we had where it was the first time we ever talked about the cult, because I didn't know that she was in a cult for the most part when we were talking, like, and I wanted to talk to her and she came forward with it. Like I didn't even have to ask her if she was in the cult or not, or if what I was hearing was true, because when I reached out to her and I said, hey, Katie, I want to catch up with you. How's it going? She was like, oh, I just found out I was in a cult. So our whole conversation was about this group. And, I had all this information that she didn't know that I had. And we had this long conversation. And then after that, the stuff with Rasha, like going back through these tapes with Rasha, I was like, what's going on with like this woman who, has all this stuff and isn't giving me any of the information? Like, is she a part of like this group? She talks about being in a cult herself at some point in one of these tapes. And I confronted Katie about it, and I was like, you got to tell me everything you know about what happened in 2015 between, you and Rasha at the radio station and the newspaper, like what was going on there. I got to know more about this story. And, I was like really, I was like super paranoid at the time. Nothing made sense. Like, I knew that Katie had, I would say, sort of like brainwashed me a little bit, maybe mild brainwashing, like back in 2017. So, which I didn't confront her about, but when we talked, I was pushing her really hard. And that's a piece of that is in the video where she talks about being a survivor, which is a really important piece of tape. But after that, I sort of came forward. She asked me, like, this all seems weird. Like, are you actually like doing a story about this? And I said, yeah, like I think we should all be honest with each other. Like, we should talk about this because, I've got this is all the information I'm working with. And like, I think if you worked with me on this, we could tell this story together in a way, or, if you confronted Mark, any way that it could have sort of saved her from whatever blowback will come when the Vermilion stuff comes out, because like, Katie is sort of like a friend of mine, even though she messed with my head. We had like, we had close relationship for a little while, but yeah, our after that, our relationship dissolved through a long series of emails, which are pretty interesting.
Right. Is this you and
yeah, at a
is
certain
this
point,
you and Rasha after you told her that you were going to be writing a piece on this?
This is me and Katie.
Right.
I confronted Rasha too, but Rasha said almost nothing, where at least like Katie was like responding to me and like giving me her thoughts on everything.
Right.
Like as we were like, I don't know, going into a place where we weren't going to talk anymore.
Right. And so the part of the documentary where you're like almost where you're kind of really angry on the phone to somebody and they're kind of telling you like, you need to calm down because I've just realized that I was a victim of sexual assault. Is that Rasha that you're speaking to at that point?
That's Katie. That's Katie.
Oh, okay. Right. So she's like,
it's tough when you just have voices.
It is, but I think both would have made sense. Whichever one you spoke to, it makes more sense that it was Katie, because she was an active member of the group and that she just actually left and then had to take a step back and realize that all of these horrible things were happening to her. But that was a really interesting piece of the documentary, because it's a very heated discussion where you're almost shouting and she's saying, you need to calm down because I'm trying to process these experiences. And I don't know if many journalists would paint themselves in that light or allow themselves to be listened to in such a vulnerable position or in such an emotional state, because a lot of journalists want to remain neutral, but you put that in there. And I thought that was really interesting for you to be like, I am furious that this has happened to me. And then Katie's like, well, you don't get to be furious right now because I'm trying to come to the terms with the fact that I was sexually assaulted. And I think she was right to call you out on that as well. And so I thought it was interesting that you included that.
No, and you know what, I think that's probably my favorite part of the video because it's so raw. And I made a bunch of mistakes. In this whole process, like we're talking about, this goes back to, 5 years ago, when this started. Like there's all kinds of, mistakes that I made that are on tape. And I think that, or times when, I'm definitely not going to look like the good guy or whatever. And that's one of them is in that situation. But that stuff is really important. Like the whole like truth of the matter is kind of like the story, and I want to present it in the most honest way I can so that people understand, because it's just like it's one of these things like me and Katie especially, like you can't tell the story without like we are sort of part of the story. Like the reporters are kind of part of the story and our lives, because there's all kinds of like personal tape out there, like of, I mean, that I would imagine will come out from like me and Katie's original conversations, that there's like, this story is like, just, I have intimacy with it. Like it means so much to me. I feel like, I've talked to these people who have like bared their souls. I've had these, just these experiences that, I show my emotions sometimes in these interviews, I guess. And that was kind of an extreme version.
You can see examples of even just emotional relationships that take place on like a social media platform, or through emails, or through text messages and phone calls, just long distance relationships that exist on an emotional basis. Like look at the Tinder swindler and how he was able to just get, so many women to send him so much money through basically like catfishing. And look at catfishing as a subject as well. So many people exist in emotional relationships and often don't realize the intentions or the true person behind the conversations that they're having. And I think that for you to include those parts of yourself where you are acting out of emotion, and where it's raw, and where you perhaps have acted incorrectly, or you are in the wrong, and you're able to admit that not only speaks to your kind of intention as a journalist, but it speaks to your integrity as well. And I think it would be difficult for people to question your integrity as a journalist if you're willing to include all of those things. If you want to create a fair narrative for us as consumers of your work, of course it's important for you to include all of it. You can't just say, I'm not going to delete anything that I have received from Katie, or any of the information that I have on Mark, or any of the supporting evidence that comes through, but I will just delete these parts where I don't sound particularly knowledgeable or in the know, or or where I don't sound correct, or any of those things, because then that would put you in the same position that Mark places himself in. So I think the fact that you have included those parts, and that you are going to have kind of this whole record of those parts of yourself included in it as a journalist as well, means that people aren't going to be able to say, he's only telling part of the story, which is so important for a journalist.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I guess there's certain stuff, like I just like, where I guess I live in public with this story in a way that I hadn't really in the past. Like that video I sent you of I contacted the FBI and I did something ridiculous.
Yes, this is what
to try to get the FBI's attention.
I was going to make sure that we added this before we finish, so I've got kind of FBI written here on my notes. So, after you became aware of these cases of abuse that were taking place, survivors coming forward with their experiences, there was mention of child abuse taking place, and after you became privy to this information and you're kind of thinking, where do I go with it, what do I do with it, I can't just sit on this information, what did you decide to do next?
So I was talking to a lot of, like, there's a couple things that were going on. One is that there was like this weird, like the body had seen something that I had made about them, like an old video, and it was Peter had seen it. He's this old man in Australia. I don't know how he found the video, but it was sort of like, well, if he's seen it, like Mark has seen it. And then there was this weird like social media account that was like following me that I know had something to do with the body, and it was like, it was making me super paranoid. And I had talked to somebody else who wanted to, who basically fed to me when I was giving them the story, like, hey, I had never considered this before, but, maybe this isn't just a story. Like, maybe these people like have committed crimes and they go to prison, like, and that's the end goal.
So,
and, I had all this tape of abuse, so I started calling law enforcement about it.
And which law enforcement did you start with?
I started with the Alaska troopers. And then there's this woman, Carrie, who she left an infant and another child in this horrible family separation and never came back for them. And her whole life was like a mystery, but I knew the town she was supposedly located in. So I talked to a lot of law enforcement in Pennsylvania. That's where the state she was in. And then, I called the FBI. I didn't have all the information that I have now about, these businesses or whatever, but I had some of it. And, I wanted to create records. Like every time I called, like I wanted, like, if they ever pick up this case, like there's all this information out there. So I was just trying to get information to law enforcement.
So so you contact the police and you give them the information, and then you're worried about child safety, so you go to the FBI, which is, of course, in a missing persons case, if there are children involved, the FBI are kind of privy to that information and become involved a lot of the time immediately. So you phone the FBI and they are kind of aren't going anywhere with your calls, so you phone them up and you take it one step further.
Yeah, I took it a few steps further. There was one night where I was like, I'm gonna call. Like, I had gotten hung up on by the FBI the night before, I think, when I had called, and I was just like so serious and I was pissed off, and I was like, today these people are gonna get these records no matter what. Like, I don't care if I have to call 100 times. Like, I'm going to get these records out there. So I'm trying to get these records out there for the FBI, and I guess I got hung up on again and again, and eventually I was like, I'm going to call in and report myself. I'm going to say that I have committed a crime and the evidence is on my computer. And so I did all this stuff to get this evidence all situated on my computer that could be transferred at some point. And the crime that I made up was that I was going to assassinate Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump in Washington, D.C. And I bought a plane ticket so the FBI could see it even. I took it pretty far.
So you phoned the FBI, had all of this information on your computer that wasn't actually linked to the false crime that you were confessing to, that you were never going to commit, in the hopes that they would come and seize your laptop and take all of this information about the body off of your laptop, and then realize that you never had any intention to attempt to assassinate the president.
Yes.
That is wild. Siren, that is wild.
Yeah, and it's one of these things, like it's just funny, like in retrospect, to go back and listen to the tape. I mean, at the time I was like dead serious about, I was so convicted about what I was doing, but you listen to it with sober ears, and it's just it's kind of funny. I mean, I also said in that tape that I had marijuana in my apartment, and I said that I was going to sell it to kids.
Oh my gosh.
Just like whatever I could tell them to get them to send somebody over.
Did any of it work?
Not exactly. I ended up, I met with the Secret Service, actually, because it's not a crime to say you're going to kill the president, but it is. It becomes an issue with the Secret Service. So I ended up talking to them. I ended up talking to the FBI about that. And I guess they helped me out, though. Like they sort of understood what I was doing. I'm not sure they had ever heard of anything like it before, but they sort of told me, you need to get in touch with immigration. You need to, if there's all these sham marriages and people are moving around, contact this group and not the FBI. Like, this is what you should be talking to them about, because I was, focused on different things that could possibly hang them up. So I ended up getting good advice, and that I followed through on through this whole escapade. But I never got them to take everything off my computer like I wanted.
They might be calling you up in a few years' time to ask you
Maybe.
if you still have it, but we'll have to wait and see. So just before we finish today, what website is it exactly where people can go and find all of your work that you have released so far, and keep an eye on anything that might come out in the future?
I mean, I would say for the website, the easiest way to find it's if you go to cultstories.com. That URL takes you to the Body International. Otherwise, thebodyintl.com is the main URL. There'll be more stuff.
I'm excited for that. I'm excited, and hopefully there'll be the new video by the time this episode gets released. If it is out by this point, I will also link that in the episode description with the website and the documentary that we've referenced today that's on YouTube. I will also put that the Land of the Body into the episode description as well. So my last question for you today, Siren, before we finish, is to ask you what advice you have for other people who are thinking about going into journalism, or other people who want to kind of perform their own investigation around a nefarious group that they have witnessed in their area or further afield.
I would say it's something like if you're passionate about it, then it's maybe something you should follow. I mean, I didn't have experience in crime before I started doing this, but I just did a lot of writing, and the only way to get better at anything is just do it a lot. And I guess you can get better at things just by like sort of participating in it. I guess I would say, like, don't do a crime story that isn't in where you live, because that has been such a pain in the ass. It's been so expensive. It's hard to get information. It's hard to get people to talk to you. So I would recommend the average sort of person looking to be a sleuth or doing investigative journalism to find something that's maybe more in their backyard than this story, because there's a reason why it's taken 5 years to get to where I am today. But also, like, it's important to me, and if a story is important to you, like, kind of no matter what, like if you think, especially if there's some like terrible thing happening and you can't get the attention of another journalist or whatever, you can work on it on your own. Like, I think,
Did you know 77% of women who wear bladder weakness products experience intimate skin irritation?
As if having incontinence wasn't stressful enough.
But Tena Intimate Pads have been gynecologist tested and do not cause skin irritation.
Gentle on my intimate skin. I need to try Tena Intimate Pads.
Visit TenaSample.com for your free sample. Kind to skin, protects like Tena.
If you look around, there are so many ways to make a difference. At Capella University, our FlexPath format gives you a different way to earn your degree. Take courses at your speed. Move on whenever you're ready. Education should fit your life. Learn more at capella.edu.
There's a lot that has come out online that is easily accessible, just because I've been just putting stuff together for a year and a half.
So if you have a passion for the subject, then pursue it. If there's a particular group you want to explore, then do that. If you want to go into journalism, but you're not sure which area of journalism you might be interested in, try a few things out and see if one thing kind of works for you more than another. Try not to get too deeply involved in a sector of journalism that doesn't kind of push your buttons or excite you, because then it might become more of a chore than a hobby or something that you enjoy. I think it's been really interesting to sit down and have this conversation. I think you've done huge amounts of work, and you've been able to highlight some very problematic things with this particular group. I couldn't find much myself when I was trying to research other than what you have managed to uncover. So I think that speaks for itself. There's supporting evidence in the documentary that you released. There's a lot more in the documentary around the shell companies and kind of transferring of funds and things as well. So I thought that was really interesting. So thank you so much for coming on the show today, talking me through your wild story and adventure, or misadventure, and that is still ongoing today. I'm excited to kind of see where the work takes you and where you'll be in 5 years' time. Perhaps there'll be a major documentary on Amazon Prime by the time we get to 5 years from now. So thank you so much for all of your work, for highlighting
thank you so much
things. I think it's important that there are people out there who are working in spaces of activism and whistleblowing to make sure that these stories are heard, and that people who are abusive, coercive, manipulating, and are taking advantage should definitely make it into the public eye. And that's what you're helping to do with all of this work that you've done. And I think it's great. So thank you so much, Syran, for your time today.
Well, yeah, thank you so much. Like, I really appreciate it. And this is also just like a step in getting the information out. Like, being on this show is, a way for people to hear about the body for the first time. And, this is, sort of like piece by piece by piece, whatever I can do to get this story out there. And you've really helped in that way. So I appreciate it. I love being on, and I just love the show generally. Like, it's a great thing that you do.
That's so fantastic for me to hear, Syran. Thank you. I will let you go, but I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
All right, thanks so much.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram @cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, and this has been the Cult Vault.